10,000 workers. A village with gardens and swimming pools and schools. A factory where the air smelled of chocolate. And the founder's rule was that every home should have enough land to grow roses. Cadbury made the chocolate that Britain grew up on. Dairy milk, cream eggs, roses at Christmas, flake in a 99. Built over 186 years by a Quaker family who believed business existed to serve the people who did the work. Then the family sold their shares. A merger diluted the values. An activist investor forced a split. And in 5 months, hedge funds who'd held their stock for weeks sold the company to an American conglomerate that broke its first promise within 7 days. Today, 1,000 workers remain where 10,000 once stood. The village endures because its founder, a century ago, made it independent of the company he knew might one day fall. This is the story of the greatest experiment in welfare capitalism that Britain ever built, and of the system that dismantled it. Not through malice, through structure. Chapter 1. The Grocer on Bull Street. The story begins with a cup of cocoa. Not the powdered instant you'd make at home. Something older. Something mixed by hand in a copper pot in a narrow brick shop on Bull Street, Birmingham, by a man who believed a warm drink could save a life, or at least steer it away from gin. John Cadbury was born on the 12th of August 1801, the 5th child of Richard Tapper Cadbury, a prosperous Quaker draper who sold silk and linen and served as chairman of Birmingham City for 15 years. The Cadburys had joined the Society of Friends in 1725 and moved from Exeter to Birmingham in 1794, drawn by the same energy that was pulling thousands into the roaring, filthy, endlessly inventive town that would soon call itself the City of 1,000 Trades. They were devout, they were stubborn, and they were, by the standards of their time, quietly radical, because being a Quaker in early 19th century England meant being shut out. Oxford and Cambridge required Anglican affiliation. The law, medicine, and the military were closed. What remained was trade. And so the Quakers traded. At 15, John was apprenticed to a Quaker tea dealer named John Cudworth in Leeds. He spent years learning the retail trade, measuring, blending, weighing, and returned to Birmingham with an idea that his father's connections and his own faith would make possible. On the 1st of March 1824, an advertisement appeared in the Birmingham Gazette. 3 days later, on the 4th of March, John opened the door of a one-man shop at 93 Bull Street, next to his father's drapery, and began selling tea, coffee, hops, mustard, and drinking chocolate. The shop was narrow. The stock was simple. John measured loose tea into paper packets, ground coffee beans by hand, and stirred hot chocolate in copper pots behind the counter. But 2 details set him apart from every other grocer on the street. First, he stamped exact weights on his packages and displayed clear prices on slate boards. No bartering, no haggling, no guessing what you'd pay. In an era when adulteration and short measures were so routine that customers expected to be cheated, John Cadbury was offering something revolutionary: honesty. When local children came in with their pennies, he filled their cups to the brim. The second detail was the chocolate itself. John hadn't chosen cocoa as a commercial calculation. He'd chosen it as a weapon. Birmingham in the 1820s had nearly 600 establishments selling alcohol, gin palaces, beer shops, taverns on every corner. And the wreckage was everywhere. Poverty, violence, families destroyed. John's own uncle had reportedly died from alcoholism. With his father, John co-founded the Birmingham Temperance Society, and for the rest of his life he was a total abstainer. At the time of his death, he'd been sober for 50 years. Cocoa was the alternative. Warm, nourishing, affordable, and it didn't ruin you. Every cup John Cadbury sold was a tiny act of social reform dressed as a commercial transaction. The drinking chocolate wasn't incidental to his business. It was the point of his business. The tea and the coffee and the mustard paid the rent. The cocoa was the mission. A family history from the period captures the man behind the counter. His naturally strong will, guided by the wisdom that is from above, enabled him to pursue his work with undeviating cheerfulness, even under bodily suffering. His garden was his delight, but the sweet pleasure he derived from it was to take baskets of fruit and flowers into the town for those who could not grow them. This wasn't a man building a chocolate empire. This was a Quaker who believed the world could be improved one cup, one honest transaction, one basket of fruit at a time. And he campaigned beyond the shop. He fought against the exploitation of child chimney sweeps. Boys as young as 4 sent up blackened flues, their knees bleeding, their lungs filling with soot. He founded the Animals Friends Society, a predecessor of the RSPCA. He served as a poor law guardian from 1830 to 1841, visiting the desperate and the destitute in their homes, which gave him, and later, crucially, his sons, a direct education in what poverty looked like, smelled like, felt like behind closed doors. By 1831, the shop had outgrown Bull Street. John moved to a 4-storey warehouse on Crooked Lane and began commercially producing drinking chocolates and cocos. By 1842, his catalogue listed 16 varieties of drinking chocolate and 11 different cocos, pressed cakes, flakes, nibs and powder. In 1847, he moved again to a larger factory on Bridge Street, connected by canal to Birmingham's entire network of ports and waterways. The business was growing, the mission was expanding, but the chocolate industry had a secret, and it was squalid. Cocoa naturally contained excessive cocoa butter, too much fat, with an unpleasant, cloying taste. To make it drinkable, manufacturers added things: potato starch, wheat flour, sago, animal fats, and worse, a study by The Lancet found that 39 of 70 cocoa samples tested had been coloured with red ochre made from ground bricks. Red lead turned up in others. The industry that John Cadbury had entered as a force for good was, in practice, poisoning its customers. Even Cadbury admitted to adding starch and flour to improve the texture of their own cocoa. Nobody's hands were entirely clean. Then came the blow that nearly ended everything. In 1855, John's second wife Candia died of tuberculosis. The grief broke something in him. His interest in the business declined sharply. The accounts deteriorated. By 1860, the company was hemorrhaging money, and in 1861, with the business facing what his sons would later describe as almost daily bankruptcy, John Cadbury retired. He handed what was left to 2 young men who had every reason to walk away. Chapter 2. Almost daily bankruptcy. Richard Cadbury was 25. George Cadbury was 21. They inherited a business with 11 employees, down from 20, and debts that threatened to swallow it entirely. Both brothers seriously considered quitting during the first 5 years. They used their shares of the £4,000 left by their mother to keep the operation alive, and they imposed on themselves a discipline that bordered on monastic. They rose at 5 in the morning, went ice skating to see the sunrise, then worked long, frugal days in a factory that was more hospice than enterprise, George was heard saying, with the kind of modest ambition that only makes sense when you're staring at ruin. If the business ever makes a profit of £1,000 a year, I'd retire a happy man. £1,000. That was the scale of the dream. Not a chocolate empire, not a model village, just survival. Richard, the elder, was the artistic one, gentler, more refined, a painter whose eye for design would later transform how Britain bought chocolates. George was the engine, stubborn, brilliant, physically tireless, and possessed of a quality that would define everything that followed. He refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. The cocoa was adulterated? Then find a way to make it pure. The workers lived in slums? Then build them something better. The factory was cramped and dark? Then move it somewhere the air was clean and the light was good. George Cadbury didn't solve problems by accepting their premises. He changed the premises. The problem in 1861 was straightforward. Their cocoa tasted wrong because it was full of additives, and it was full of additives because nobody in Britain had figured out how to make it without them. Cocoa beans, when roasted and ground, produced a paste that was roughly 53% fat. That excess cocoa butter made the product heavy, greasy, and unappealing. Every manufacturer in the country masked the problem by adding starch, flour, and whatever else would stretch the product and absorb the fat. The result was drinkable, barely, but it wasn't honest. And for two Quaker brothers raised on the principle that deception in trade was a sin, the adulteration crisis wasn't just a commercial problem. It was a moral one. George had heard about a machine. In the Netherlands, a man named Coenraad Johannes van Houten had developed a hydraulic press that could squeeze the excess cocoa butter out of roasted cocoa beans, reducing the fat content from roughly 53% to 28%. What remained was a lighter, more soluble powder that needed no adulterants to taste good. The Dutch had been using it for years. Nobody in Britain had one. George travelled to Holland. He didn't speak Dutch. Through hand gestures, persistence, and what can only be described as the sheer force of Quaker determination, he convinced Van Houten to sell him a defatting press. The price was approximately £1,000, reportedly most of his remaining inheritance. It was the kind of gamble that either saves a business or buries it. It saved the business. The result was Cadbury's Cocoa Essence, launched for Christmas 1866, with a slogan that was as revolutionary as the product itself. Absolutely pure, therefore best. It was the first unadulterated cocoa sold in Britain. No starch, no flour, no brick dust, no animal fats, just cocoa. The Quaker conscience had produced a commercial breakthrough, purity as both principle and selling point. The timing could not have been better. Mid-Victorian Britain was gripped by a growing obsession with food purity. The adulteration of food. Acts of 1872 and 1875 gave Cadbury free publicity. Here was a product that was already pure before the law demanded it. George, ever the strategist, lobbied government to require that any product containing additives could not legally be labelled as cocoa. Competitors who'd been adulterating for years were suddenly exposed and prosecuted. Cadbury's wasn't just selling better cocoa. It was setting the rules of the market. And there was a bonus. An accidental gift from the Van Houten press that would shape the next century of British confectionery. The cocoa butter squeezed out of the beans during the defatting process was a usable byproduct. Mixed with sugar and cocoa powder, it could be moulded into a solid form. Eating chocolate. Not drinking chocolate. Something you could hold in your hand, unwrap, break apart. The surplus fat from a Quaker's quest for purity became the foundation of the modern chocolate bar. Richard, meanwhile, was transforming how chocolate was sold. From 1861, he'd been designing fancy boxes, ornate containers decorated with his own paintings of flowers, landscapes, and children. These weren't merely packaging. They were gifts. In 1868, Richard created the first heart-shaped box of chocolates for Valentine's Day. A gesture so perfectly calibrated to sentiment that it entered the Guinness Book of World Records and has been imitated in every chocolate shop and supermarket aisle ever since. In 1875, the first Cadbury Easter egg appeared. Richard Cadbury had understood something about chocolate that his brother George, for all his brilliance, might have missed. It wasn't just a product. It was an emotion, something you gave to someone you loved. By the late 1870s, the turnaround was extraordinary. The business that had nearly died in 1861 was thriving. Sales of cocoa essence were climbing. The product range was expanding. The workforce at the Bridge Street factory had grown to approximately 200. By 1897, Cadbury's chocolate sales would surpass Fry and Sons of Bristol, making it the largest chocolate distributor in the United Kingdom. But George Cadbury wasn't satisfied. The factory was thriving. The products were honest. The business was growing. And every Sunday morning he cycled to the Birmingham Adult School at 6 o'clock to teach Bible class, a commitment he maintained for over 50 years, ultimately teaching more than 4,000 students. It was the visits to those students' homes afterwards that changed everything. Chapter 3. A place where roses grow. To understand what George Cadbury built, you have to understand what he was building against. Victorian Birmingham was magnificent and appalling in equal measure. The city of 1,000 trades, guns, jewellery, buttons, brass, steel pens, with nearly 2,000 factory chimneys filling the sky by the century's end. The wealth was extraordinary. the poverty was medieval. Almost half the population lived in back-to-back houses. Pairs of dwellings sharing a rear wall, each room roughly 13 to 14 feet square, 3 rooms in total. No running water, no toilet. Shared privies in conditions that defied description. The 1842 Health of Towns Commission found more than 2,000 courts in Birmingham Parish, housing over 50,000 people. Dr. Robinson, Birmingham's medical officer of health, wrote in 1904 of floors laid directly on bare earth, filth accumulated above the ceiling laths, and pan closets whose stench pervades the courtyard and can be smelled in the interior of the houses. Average life expectancy in industrial areas hovered around 40 years. In Manchester, Edwin Chadwick's landmark 1842 report found that labourers died at an average age of just 17, a figure skewed by devastating infant mortality, where 1 child in 5 died before their first birthday and 1 in 3 before the age of 5. Tuberculosis killed over 40% of young adults aged 15 to 34 in the 1850s. These weren't statistics to George Cadbury. They were the homes he walked into every Sunday afternoon, the families of the students he'd just been teaching. The squalor wasn't abstract. It was in the room with him. His question became famous. Why should an industrial area be squalid and depressing? It wasn't rhetorical. George Cadbury intended to answer it. The Bridge Street factory, adequate when John had moved there in 1847, was hopelessly cramped by the late 1870s. 200 workers and growing, in a building designed for a fraction of that number. George needed to expand. But his motivations went far beyond logistics. He'd spent years watching what happened to people who lived and worked in Birmingham's industrial core. The disease, the exhaustion, the slow grinding down of human potential by bad air, bad water, and bad housing. He wasn't just looking for a bigger factory. He was looking for a different kind of world. On the 18th of June, 1878, George and Richard found their site, the Bourneville estate. 14.5 acres of Worcestershire countryside, 4 miles south of Birmingham's centre. A meadow, a cottage, a stream called the Bourne, the Georgian Bournebrook Hall standing opposite, and 2 transport links that made the site practical as well as beautiful. The Birmingham West Suburban Railway at Sturchley Street Station, and the Worcester and Birmingham Canal. Dual routes for cocoa deliveries and milk supplies. They named it Bourneville, Bourne for the stream, Ville because French-sounding names were fashionable for confectionery. It was a name invented for a place that didn't yet exist, for a vision that nobody else had attempted at this scale. Construction began in January 1879. The factory, designed by Birmingham architect George H. Gadd, opened that September when the first trainload of 230 workers arrived from the city. But from the very first day, this was not a conventional Victorian factory. George insisted on properly heated dressing rooms, kitchens where workers could warm their food, separate gardens, one for women, one for men, where employees could sit during breaks and breathe air that didn't taste of soot. Amenities, as one account put it, simply unknown in Victorian times. George's philosophy was captured in a single sentence. If the country is a good place to live in, why not to work in? That sentence changed British industrial history. 16 cottages for key workers were built alongside the factory from the start. But George was thinking on a scale that nobody around him had imagined. In 1893, he purchased 120 acres of land close to the factory, at his own personal expense, not with company funds. This distinction matters enormously because it was the first structural decision that would ultimately protect the village when the company fell. George wasn't building a company town. He was building something that would belong to no company at all. The formal building estate was established in 1895. The architect was William Alexander Harvey, appointed at just 20 years old, a prodigy who would spend his career giving physical form to George Cadbury's vision. Harvey created what Nicholas Pevsner, the great architectural historian, would later call perhaps the fullest expression of arts and crafts ideals in Birmingham. Stepped gables, timber corner porches, handmade bricks and clay tile roofs, vernacular rural styles drawn from local building traditions, using local materials. No two houses were identical, yet all maintained a visual harmony that made the estate feel like a village that had grown organically rather than one that had been planned on a drawing board. The rules were precise, and they revealed everything about George Cadbury's philosophy. Each house occupied no more than a quarter of its building plot. Each garden was not less than 1/6 of an acre, approximately 670 square metres. Every garden was stocked with at least 6 fruit trees: apple, pear, plum, plus gooseberry bushes. Streets were lined with trees. There were no back alleys. House orientations varied to avoid the soul-crushing uniformity of the terraced rows that George had walked through every Sunday. And there were no public houses. Not one. The Quaker temperance rule, embedded in the foundations of the estate, persists to this day. George's most famous declaration summed up everything. No man ought to be condemned to live in a place where a rose cannot grow. By 1900, the estate held 313 houses on 330 acres. But the decision that would outlast everything else came on the 14th of December 1900, when George established the Bourneville Village Trust as an independent charity, deliberately, structurally, legally separate from the Cadbury Company. The Trust's stated objective: the amelioration of the condition of the working class and labouring population by the provision of improved dwellings with gardens and open spaces. This was George Cadbury's masterwork. Not the chocolate, not the factory, not even the village itself. The trust. Because by making the village independent of the company, he ensured that whatever happened to Cadbury, and George, who understood the fragility of commercial enterprises, must have known that something would happen eventually. The community would survive. He built the walls of the village out of brick and tile. He built its permanence out of law. The community was intentionally mixed. Fewer than half of the residents worked at the Cadbury factory. This was not a company town where the employer controlled housing and therefore controlled the workforce. It was a vision of how all working people might live, regardless of who employed them. George Cadbury had taken the Quaker conviction that business exists to serve the community and given it a physical form that could endure beyond any single business. The question that every visitor asked, and that thousands of workers across Britain must have silently posed, was simple. If this is possible, why isn't it normal? If a chocolate maker can build a village with gardens and fruit trees and clean air and schools, why can't every employer? Why should an industrial area be squalid and depressing? George Cadbury had answered his own question. The answer was Bourneville. And in the decades that followed, that answer would grow into something that even he might not have imagined. A working world so complete, so humane, so anchored in the conviction that workers deserved dignity, that it would become the blueprint for an entire nation's idea of what employment could be. The chocolate smell was already drifting across the village from the factory. It would become the sensory signature of Bourneville life, the scent that told you where you were, that clung to your clothes, that 30 years after you'd left, you could still recall in perfect detail. Because it wasn't just the smell of chocolate, it was the smell of something working. Chapter 4. The smell of something working. By the early 20th century, the Bourneville factory had become something that no management textbook had a name for. A place where the production of chocolate and the production of human welfare were treated as the same enterprise. The morning began before you reached the gates. If you were walking from the village, you'd catch the smell first: cocoa butter warming in the roasting halls, a rich, deep sweetness that carried across the playing fields and through the tree-lined streets and settled into the fabric of your coat before you'd even clocked in. Workers arriving by train at Bourneville station, painted in Cadbury purple, the only station on the line with that distinction, stepped onto the platform and into a wall of it. Former employees, decades after they'd left, would describe the smell as the thing they remembered most vividly. Not the machinery, not the noise, but that thick, warm, unmistakable scent of chocolate being made at industrial scale. It got into everything. Your hair, your clothes, the lining of your bag. You carried it home with you, and your family knew where you'd been without asking. Through the gates, the scale announced itself. What had begun as a single factory building in 1879 had grown, by the 1920s and 1930s, into a sprawling complex of red brick production halls, warehouses, laboratories, offices, and the vast cocoa block where the raw beans arrived and the transformation began. The site covered acres. Internal roads connected the buildings. Lorries moved between departments carrying ingredients and finished goods on routes that functioned like streets within a town, which, in a sense, is exactly what the factory had become. The cocoa block was where the journey started. Raw cocoa beans arrived by canal barge and railway wagon from West Africa, primarily the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, where Cadbury had established supply relationships that the company would later, uncomfortably, be forced to defend against allegations of exploitative labour practices on the plantations. The beans were cleaned, sorted by hand, then fed into enormous roasting drums where temperatures climbed high enough to crack the outer shells and release the nibs inside. The roasting was an art as much as a science. Too little and the flavour stayed flat. Too much and it turned bitter. The roasters knew by smell when the batch was right. That knowledge lived in their noses, not in any manual, and it had been passed from one generation to the next since George Cadbury's day. From roasting, the nibs moved to grinding, heavy stone mills and steel rollers that crushed them into a thick, dark paste called cocoa liquor. The heat of the grinding melted the cocoa butter within the nibs, producing a liquid that was simultaneously the raw material for drinking cocoa and the base for eating chocolate. This was where Van Houten's press, the machine George had bought with most of his inheritance, did its work, squeezing the liquor under hydraulic pressure to separate the butter from the solid. The butter went one way, to be recombined later with sugar and milk for chocolate bars. The dry cake went another, to be ground into cocoa powder. The chocolate-making halls were where the real alchemy happened. Cocoa liquor, cocoa butter, sugar and fresh full-cream milk, sourced from farms across the Midlands and delivered daily, were blended in enormous vats called mélangeurs, then passed through a sequence of steel rollers that refined the particle size until the mixture was smooth enough to feel like silk on the tongue. The critical stage was conching, a process invented by the Swiss chocolatier Rodolphe Lindt, in which the chocolate was heated and continuously stirred in shell-shaped vessels for hours, sometimes days, driving off volatile acids and developing the rounded, mellow flavour that distinguished good chocolate from merely acceptable chocolate. The conching rooms hummed. The air was warm and thick with a smell so intense it was almost a taste, a sweetness that clung to the back of your throat. From conching, the liquid chocolate moved to the moulding halls, where it was poured into shaped moulds, vibrated to remove air bubbles, cooled in long tunnels, and turned out as the finished bars, blocks and shapes that would carry the Cadbury name across the world. The moulding lines ran continuously, a procession of identical purple-wrapped bars emerging from the cooling tunnels at a pace that was mesmerising to watch, one after another, each one stamped with the glass-and-a-half symbol that had become as recognisable as any emblem in British commerce. Women in white uniforms, the Cadbury's Angels as they were known, inspected, wrapped and packed the bars into boxes with a speed and precision that came from years of practice. Their hands moved so fast that visitors standing at the gallery rail couldn't follow the motion. And through every stage, in every hall, the one constant was the warmth. Chocolate production requires heat for roasting, grinding, conching, tempering, and the factory radiated it. In winter, workers arrived from cold village streets into buildings that were warm before the shift began. The heating wasn't incidental. George Cadbury had insisted, from the very first building, on properly heated dressing rooms and kitchens. By the 1930s, the factory was maintained at temperatures calibrated to the needs of the chocolate, which happened conveniently to be comfortable for the people making it. The product and the workforce demanded the same environment. George would have appreciated the symmetry. But the factory was more than a production facility. By 1902, 30% of Cadbury's capital expenditure was being spent on workers' welfare, a figure that would have been incomprehensible to any shareholder-driven enterprise then or now. A works medical department provided doctors, dentists and nurses on site. Sick pay covered up to 90% of base wage. A pension fund received £60,000 from the company in 1906 alone. Standard hours were reduced to 44 per week by 1911, with Saturday half-days and bank holiday closings pioneered years before they became industry norms. The factory had swimming baths, separate buildings for men and women, where workers could swim before or after their shifts. It had playing fields, bowling greens, cricket pitches, a fishing lake. It had gardens where you could sit in your break and hear nothing but birdsong and the distant hum of the conching machines. And from 1918, it had democracy. Elected works councils gave equal numbers of workers and management a formal voice in factory governance. Decisions about working conditions, welfare provision, and factory rules were made jointly, not handed down from above. This was not consultation. It was shared power, decades before any British law required it, in a factory that made chocolate. Chapter 5. Cadbury's Angels and the Village That Shifts Built. The women came first in the morning. Hundreds of them, walking in groups from the village or stepping off the train, their white uniforms already on beneath their coats, heading for the wrapping halls and the packing rooms and the quality inspection lines where their hands and their eyes determined whether a bar of dairy milk met the standard. Women accounted for over half of Cadbury's workforce in the early 20th century, and the company's approach to employing them was, for the time, extraordinary. Cadbury operated gender-segregated management, separate welfare officers, separate recreational facilities, separate career structures, specifically designed to increase women's opportunities for advancement. A woman at Cadbury didn't answer to a male supervisor on the packing line. She answered to a female manager who'd come up through the same department and understood the work from the inside. Dame Elizabeth Cadbury, George's wife, was the driving force behind much of this. Born in 1858, she married George in 1888 and immediately became not just a partner in his domestic life, but a co-architect of his social vision. She campaigned for women's education at a time when the idea was still controversial. She founded the Birmingham Union of Girls' Clubs, providing recreational and educational opportunities for working-class young women across the city. She served as a Birmingham City Councillor, one of the first women to do so. Edward Cadbury, one of George's sons, co-authored a serious academic study of women's labour conditions in Birmingham, published as Women's Work and Wages. The Cadbury commitment to women workers wasn't a corporate initiative dreamed up by a marketing department. It was a family conviction, driven by people who'd spent their lives in the communities they employed. Multi-generational employment was the norm, and it created a continuity that shaped the culture of the factory as powerfully as any management directive. A father in the power station, a son on the production line, a daughter in the wrapping hall, a grandson in the laboratory. Families built their lives around Cadbury, not because they had no other options, but because the package of wages, welfare, housing, education and community made Cadbury the best option available to working people in the West Midlands by a margin that no competitor could approach. The village itself had grown into something that no other industrial enterprise in Britain could match. By the early 20th century, Bourneville featured a network of institutions that predated the welfare state by decades, and, in some cases, surpassed what the welfare state would eventually provide. Bourneville Junior School opened in 1905. Its grounds dominated by a carillon tower housing 48 bells, one of the largest carillons in the country, inspired by one George had heard during a trip to Belgium. The sound of those bells, ringing across the village on a Sunday morning, became as much a part of Bourneville's identity as the chocolate smell from the factory. Bourneville Infant School followed in 1910, designed to look not like an institution but like a Tudor manor house, with timber-framed gables and the kind of architectural care that most builders reserved for the homes of the wealthy. The Day Continuation School, established in 1925, made education compulsory for workers aged 14 to 18, English, maths, science, physical education, handicrafts, and by the 1930s some 3,000 students attended on day release from the factory. Cadbury was educating its workforce on company time, at company expense, a generation before the state required anything of the kind. The recreational facilities were staggering. Indoor swimming baths on Bourneville Lane, an outdoor Lido at Roeheath, fed by a natural mineral spring. Roe Heath Pavilion itself, opened in July 1924, sat at the centre of acres of sports fields, bowling greens, a fishing lake, a running track, cricket and football pitches, all free for employees and their families. On summer evenings and Saturday afternoons, the playing fields were alive with the sound of matches being played and children running and the quiet, persistent drift of chocolate on the breeze. The almshouses, built in 1897, provided 33 single-storey bungalows arranged around a grassy quadrangle with a clock tower and an orchard, designed by architect Ewan Harper for Richard Cadbury, mainly for retired workers who had given their productive years to the factory and deserved comfort in return. Selly Manor, a 14th-century timber-frame building, had been purchased by George Cadbury, dismantled from its original site, transported piece by piece, and re-erected in Bourneville between 1912 and 1916 as a museum and community asset. At the heart of the village, the Green, a triangular social hub at the junction of Sycamore Road and Linden Road, centred on the Rest House, built in 1914 and modelled on Dunster's medieval butter market, where residents gathered in all weathers. The Friends Meeting House stood beside the Green, quiet and unadorned in the Quaker way, and it was there that George Cadbury's ashes, and those of Dame Elizabeth, would eventually be interred. A correspondent for Myra's Journal, visiting in the 1880s, described encountering the strong, permeating, ever-present and pleasant odour as of freshly poured-out chocolate. That smell was the thread that connected everything: the factory, the village, the schools, the playing fields, the gardens with their 6 fruit trees per plot. You couldn't live in Bourneville and not know what made it possible. The chocolate was in the air you breathed. It was the material proof that a factory could sustain not just production, but an entire way of life. And it was sustainable. The village wasn't a philanthropic gesture that drained the company's resources. It was an investment in a workforce that was healthier, better educated, more loyal, and more productive than any competitors. Cadbury's labour turnover was remarkably low. Absenteeism was minimal. The quality of the workforce, their skill, their pride, their attachment to the product, was a competitive advantage that no rival could replicate simply by offering higher wages. You couldn't buy what Bourneville produced in its workers. You had to build it, over generations, one garden and one school and one swimming pool at a time. Chapter 6. Glass and a Half. By the 1930s, Cadbury wasn't just the largest chocolate company in Britain. It was one of the most recognised brands on earth, and its products had woven themselves so deeply into British culture that separating Cadbury from the national identity was like trying to separate tea from the afternoon. Dairy milk, launched in 1905 and developed by George Cadbury Jr. with a higher proportion of fresh milk than any rival product, 2.5 glasses per half-pound bar, had become the dominant force in British chocolate by 1914. By 1936, dairy milk alone held 60% of the UK milk chocolate market. The company estimated that 90% of the British population could readily afford their chocolate. This wasn't a luxury product. It was a democratic one, an affordable pleasure available to almost everyone, and that universality was itself a fulfilment of the Quaker conviction that the good things in life shouldn't be reserved for those who could pay the most. The product timeline that followed dairy milk built an empire of small pleasures, each one calibrated to a specific moment, a specific emotion, a specific British ritual. Milk Tray appeared in 1915 and democratised the gift box. No longer did you need to afford Richard Cadbury's elaborate fancy boxes to give someone you cared about a box of chocolates. Flake arrived in 1920, born when an employee noticed that chocolate overflowing from a mould fell into delicate, crumbling folds, and it became the iconic chocolate tucked into the top of a 99 ice cream cone, inseparable from the sound of a seaside van's chimes on a summer afternoon. Roses, the twist-wrapped assortment launched in 1938 to compete with Mackintosh's Quality Street, became synonymous with Christmas. The tin on the coffee table, the arguments over who got the last strawberry cream, the rustle of foil wrappers that meant the holidays had properly begun. And creme egg, which took its modern form in 1971, became a seasonal phenomenon so powerful that its arrival in shops each January signalled the unofficial start of spring. Cadbury held a royal warrant from Queen Victoria, granted in 1854, and maintained it through every subsequent monarch, a continuous thread of royal endorsement that wouldn't be broken until King Charles III declined to renew it in 2024. The warrant meant something. It meant that the same chocolate eaten by a factory worker's child on a Saturday afternoon was, in principle, the same chocolate served at Buckingham Palace. The Quaker levelling instinct embedded in every bar. The export markets expanded relentlessly. By 1914, exports accounted for 40% of Cadbury's sales. The first overseas factory opened in Hobart, Tasmania in 1918, staffed partly by 16 women sent from Bourneville to train the local workforce, missionaries of chocolate, carrying the Cadbury method across the world. Factories followed in New Zealand, South Africa, India. In India, Cadbury would eventually command 70% of the chocolate market. A dominance so complete that the brand name became, in Hindi and many Indian languages, effectively synonymous with the word chocolate itself. The factory at Bourneville employed approximately 10,000 workers by the late 1930s. 10,000 people making chocolate, in a factory surrounded by gardens and playing fields and schools and swimming pools, in a village where every home had fruit trees and no house looked like any other and the air smelled of cocoa. When King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited on the 1st of March 1939, those 10,000 employees lined the route. It was a display of loyalty, certainly, but it was also a display of something rarer: pride. Pride in the product. Pride in the place. Pride in belonging to something that proved a factory didn't have to be a sentence. And there was one more connection between Bourneville and the wider culture that deserves its place in the story. Between the wars, Cadbury sent packages of new chocolate varieties to schools across the country for testing. Market research disguised as treats, delivered to classrooms where children rated the flavours and sent their verdicts back to the factory. Among the schoolboys who received those packages was a young Roald Dahl. The experience stayed with him. The idea of a magical factory where chocolate was invented and tested, where the production process itself was a kind of wonderland. That idea became Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Cadbury's Bourneville was, quite literally, the real Willy Wonka's factory. The most beloved children's book about chocolate was inspired by the most ambitious experiment in welfare capitalism that Britain had ever produced. Cadbury was not alone in the Quaker tradition of responsible business. 3 great Quaker chocolate families dominated British confectionery. Fry's of Bristol, founded in 1761, the oldest, producers of the first chocolate bar in 1847. Rowntree's of York, founded in 1862, creators of Kit Kat, Smarties and Quality Street, and Cadbury of Birmingham. All 3 built progressive welfare programmes for their workers. Joseph Rowntree's son Seabohm conducted one of history's first empirical poverty studies in York in 1901, finding over 27% of the city's population below the poverty line, research that influenced the liberal welfare reforms and laid groundwork for the welfare state itself. But what made Cadbury different was scale. Rowntree built New Earswick, 150 acres, beautifully planned. Bourneville grew to 1,000 acres with nearly 8,000 homes and 25,000 residents. No other industrial welfare experiment in British history came close. George Cadbury's innovations, pensions, medical care, education, elected works councils, didn't just predate the welfare state. They became blueprints for it. His purchase of the Daily News in 1901 gave him a newspaper platform to campaign for old age pensions and against sweated labour. He funded Keir Hardie's 1900 parliamentary campaign in Merthyr Tydfil. The Quaker grocer's son from Bull Street had become, without ever seeking elected office, one of the most influential social reformers in Edwardian Britain. Chapter 7. The Summit. Cadbury was voted among the top 10 most admired companies in Britain for 11 consecutive years. It was a constant constituent of the FTSE 100 from the index's creation in 1984. Cadbury World, the visitor attraction built on the factory site, opened on the 14th of August 1990 and would welcome over 18 million visitors, more than 500,000 every year, making it one of the most popular paid attractions in the Midlands. The advertising became iconic. The glass-and-a-half symbol, introduced in 1928, ran for decades. The milk tray man, from the 1960s, performed increasingly outlandish stunts to deliver a box of chocolates to a sleeping woman, a campaign that became a fixture of British television for over 30 years. The Flake Girl advertisements, languid and sensual, defined an era of confectionery marketing. But the cultural apex came in August 2007. A 90-second advertisement, created by Juan Cabral at Fallon, London, at a cost of £6.2 million, featuring nothing but a gorilla in a recording studio, sitting behind a drum kit, playing along to Phil Collins's In the Air Tonight. No chocolate, no product shot until the final frame. Just a gorilla drumming with an intensity and a joy that somehow, inexplicably, brilliantly, made you want to buy a bar of dairy milk. It received over 6 million views in its first weeks. It won the Film Grand Prix Lion at Cannes in 2008. It drove a 9 to 10% increase in dairy milk sales. And it sent Collins' song back to #1 in every market where the advertisement aired. It was the most celebrated British advertisement of its decade, and it was made for a chocolate company whose founder had started with a pestle and mortar in a shop on Bull Street. That was the summit, the highest point of a parabola that had been climbing for 180 years, from a narrow brick shop where a Quaker grocer filled children's cups to the brim, through a factory where 10,000 workers lined up for a king, to a gorilla drumming on television screens around the world. But the summit was already a ledge, because by the time that gorilla was drumming, the company whose name appeared in the final frame was no longer the company that George Cadbury had built. The family was gone. The Quaker ethos was a memory. The ownership was dispersed across international shareholders who had never walked through the gates at Bourneville, never smelled the chocolate on the breeze, never understood that the glass-and-a-half symbol represented something more than a recipe. It represented a covenant. And covenants, once the people who made them are gone, are only as strong as the structures that protect them. The Cadbury family had held approximately 50% of ordinary shares when the company went public in 1962. By the time Sir Dominic Cadbury, the last family member to serve in the company, educated at Eton, Trinity College, Cambridge and Stanford, retired on his 60th birthday, the 12th of May 2000, family and trust shares had declined to less than 1% of total equity. The fortress was unmanned, and the predators were already circling. Chapter 8. The drawbridge comes down. The erosion didn't arrive as a crisis. It arrived as a series of reasonable decisions, each one defensible on its own terms, each one removing another brick from the wall that George Cadbury had built. The first was going public. In 1962, under Chairman Paul Cadbury, Cadbury listed its shares on the stock exchange. At that moment, the family still held 7 of 13 board seats and approximately 50% of ordinary shares. The Fries, whose Bristol chocolate business Cadbury had absorbed in 1919, held another 10%. The company was public in name, but still, in practice, a family enterprise. But hundreds of non-working Cadbury family members, descendants who'd inherited shares but had never set foot in the roasting halls or walked the village green, wanted liquidity. They wanted their money out, and the only way to give them that was to let the market in. It was understandable. It was the beginning of the end. The second decision came 6 years later, in the autumn of 1968, when Lord Watkinson, Harold Watkinson, chairman of Schweppes, former Conservative Defence Minister, met Adrian Cadbury at a trade show. Adrian, great-grandson of the founder, had been chairman since 1965 and understood the commercial pressure. Both companies were too small to compete with the American conglomerates that were consolidating the global food industry. Schweppes had just acquired Typhoo Tea, but recognised its capital base was insufficient. Cadbury was almost entirely dependent on cocoa, a single commodity vulnerable to price swings, weather and political instability in West Africa. Separately, they were exposed. Together, they might survive. In January 1969, the merger was agreed. Technically, Schweppes was the surviving company, buying out Cadbury stockholders with $290 million of Schweppes stock. Lord Watkinson became chairman. Adrian Cadbury became deputy chairman. The new entity was called Cadbury Schweppes, and on paper it looked like a sensible consolidation of two vulnerable British companies into something stronger. But Schweppes distributed Dubonnet. Its products were associated with alcohol, with cocktail hours and tonic water, and the kind of sophisticated metropolitan drinking that was the precise opposite of everything John Cadbury had stood against when he'd co-founded the Birmingham Temperance Society 140 years earlier. The Quaker company, built on the conviction that cocoa could save people from gin, had merged with a company whose business was, in significant part, selling them something to mix with it. Adrian Cadbury himself later acknowledged that some aspects of the Quaker business developed over the previous century were now outdated. It was an honest assessment. It was also a concession that the values which had built Bourneville, the values that had made the company different from every other chocolate manufacturer in the world, were now regarded, in the boardroom, as quaint. The Quaker ethos didn't die overnight. It faded, meeting by meeting, decision by decision, as the culture shifted from moral stewardship to shareholder returns. The language changed first. Then the priorities followed. Sir Dominic Cadbury, the last family member to serve in the company, had been educated at Eton, Trinity College, Cambridge, and Stanford Business School. He served as CEO from 1983 and chairman from 1993. He was, by all accounts, a capable executive. But he was also the last person in the building who carried the family name and understood in his bones what that name had once meant. When he retired on his 60th birthday, the 12th of May 2000, there was nobody left to remember. And the danger of what happened when nobody was left to remember had already been demonstrated, brutally, specifically, and with consequences that Cadbury's own leadership had watched from across the confectionery aisle. In 1988, Nestlé launched a hostile takeover of Rowntree, Cadbury's Quaker cousin in York, the makers of Kit Kat, Smarties and Quality Street. The bid was £2.55 billion. Rowntree's chairman, Kenneth Dixon, declared publicly that Nestlé had nothing Rowntree needed. Not its money, not its research, not its marketing, not its distribution. Workers wearing hands-off T-shirts marched in London. 13,000 readers of the Yorkshire Evening Press backed the campaign to keep Rowntree independent. It was futile. The Thatcher government, following the Tebbit guidelines, decided not to refer the bid to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission. Nestlé held only 3% of the UK confectionery market. No competition concerns. But the deeper injustice was structural, and it would prove fatal for Cadbury 22 years later. Nestlé's Swiss share structure, a two-tier system of bearer and registered shares, made it virtually impossible for anyone to take over Nestlé. The castle was impregnable. But British companies had no equivalent protection. Their drawbridges were down. As one MP noted during the parliamentary debate, Nestlé could lower the drawbridge and seize in dawn raids assets built up over many years, returning to an impregnable castle. MPs specifically debated whether Cadbury and Rowntree should merge to create a British champion, a world leader in chocolate that could defend itself. Birmingham MP Anthony Beaumont Dark argued they would fit ideally together, but the Monopolies and Mergers Commission would have blocked it. Together, Cadbury and Rowntree held over 50% of UK confectionery. A domestic merger was impossible. A foreign bidder with 3% market share faced no such restriction. The system protected competition. It did not protect communities or workforces or 120 years of welfare capitalism built on Quaker principles. Dominic Cadbury watched the Rowntree takeover and called it a big fork in the road, the great opportunity to create a British world leader in chocolate. But we didn't have a prayer in pulling it off. After Nestlé took Rowntree, the York workforce was cut by 2,000 between 1988 and 1994. Smarties production moved to Hamburg, Dairy Box to Spain, Black Magic to the Czech Republic. The pattern was established, the script was written, and Cadbury, having watched its cousin consumed, did nothing to change its own defences, because, in truth, under the British system, there was almost nothing it could do. Chapter 9. The Bullseye is Painted. The final act began with a man named Nelson Peltz. Peltz, through his New York-based Trian Fund Management, had already profited from Cadbury once. He'd sold Snapple to Cadbury Schweppes for $1.45 billion in 2000. In March 2007, he acquired approximately 3% of Cadbury Schweppes shares. His argument was familiar to anyone who'd watched activist investors operate. The sum of the parts exceeded the whole. Split the company. Unlock the value. The beverages business and the confectionery business were worth more apart than together. Cadbury's CEO, Todd Stitzer, had publicly ruled out splitting the company as recently as October 2006. 5 months later, with Peltz's stake disclosed, the calculus changed. On the 15th of March 2007, just 2 days after Peltz's holding was made public, Cadbury Schweppes unveiled a plan to separate its beverages and confectionery businesses. Whether the timing was coincidence or capitulation, the effect was the same. The demerger was approved on the 11th of April 2008, effective the 2nd of May. Cadbury Schweppes became 2 companies. Cadbury plc, listed on the London Stock Exchange, holding the confectionery business, and Dr Pepper Snapple Group, listed on the New York Stock Exchange, holding the beverages. The separation cost approximately £1 billion, 1/10 of the combined company's value, bloated by the credit crunch that was already freezing global capital markets. Todd Stitzer was now CEO of a standalone confectionery company. It was smaller. It was more exposed. It had just lost the #1 global confectionery position to Mars Wrigley following Mars's $23 billion acquisition of Wrigley's. 50% of Cadbury's shares were American-owned, compared to 28% held by British investors. There were no defensive share structures, no poison pills, no Swiss-style protections of the kind that made Nestlé untouchable. Management today reported it explicitly. There is speculation that Cadbury plc, once demerged from its drinks business, could make a ripe takeover target. The bullseye was painted. The question was no longer whether someone would bid. It was who and when. Chapter 10. The Cheese Company. Irene Rosenfeld was born on the 3rd of May 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, the daughter of an accountant. She studied at Cornell, a BA in psychology, an MS in business, a PhD in marketing and statistics, and had returned to Kraft Foods as CEO in June 2006 after a stint running Frito-Lay for PepsiCo. She was described as driven and decisive, and she wanted Cadbury. Kraft Foods was a sluggish American food conglomerate: processed cheese, Oscar Mayer hot dogs, Jell-O, Maxwell House coffee. Its growth was stagnant. Its brands were aging. Rosenfeld's strategy was transformation. Acquire Cadbury and convert Kraft from a domestic American pantry staple into a global snacking powerhouse. Cadbury's strength in emerging markets was the prize: 70% market share in India, leadership in 20 of the world's top 50 confectionery markets, distribution networks across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America that Kraft couldn't replicate in a decade. On the 28th of August 2009, Rosenfeld met Roger Carr privately. Carr, born in Nottingham in 1946, educated at Nottingham High School and Trent Polytechnic, a self-made man who'd worked his way up through Boots and Honeywell, had been Cadbury's chairman since the 2008 demerger. Rosenfeld proposed buying Cadbury for approximately 755 pence per share, in a mix of cash and Kraft stock. Carr dismissed the approach. On the 7th of September, Kraft went public with an indicative offer of £10.2 billion, approximately 745 pence per share. Cadbury's board rejected it immediately, stating it fundamentally undervalued the company. On the 12th of September, Carr wrote to Rosenfeld calling the bid an unappealing prospect, the prospect of being absorbed into Kraft's low-growth conglomerate business. Carr labelled the offer derisory. He argued it valued Cadbury at only 12 times earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization, when comparable transactions in the sector ranged from 14 to 18.5 times. Todd Stitzer upgraded his revenue growth targets to 5 to 7% and projected margins of 16 to 18% by 2013, trying to demonstrate that Cadbury was worth more alive and independent than dead and digested by Kraft. He called it an exceptional standalone business. And on the same day it had announced its bid, the 7th of September 2009, Kraft made a statement that would become the defining lie of the entire story. Kraft declared it believed it could reverse Cadbury's decision to close the Somerdale factory near Keynsham, Bristol, thereby preserving UK manufacturing jobs. Somerdale. A factory originally built by the Fry family in the 1920s, producing Cadbury's fudge, Curly Wurly, Turkish Delight and mini eggs. Cadbury had announced its closure in October 2007, with the loss of approximately 500 jobs, and production was already being transferred to a new 65,000 square metre facility in Skarbimierz, Poland. Kraft's promise to save Somerdale was repeated in formal offer documents, in public statements, in communications to Parliament, to workers, to the media, and to the British public. It was made again and again across 5 months of battle to a country that was watching one of its most beloved companies being stalked by an American conglomerate that made processed cheese. The battle was spirited. Alternative bidders were explored. Hershey confirmed interest. Carr indicated it might be preferred for its similar values. Ferrero reviewed a possible bid. Nestlé was rumoured, but Hershey announced on the 22nd of January 2010 that it would not counter. Nestlé had ruled itself out on the 5th of January. No white knight came. Warren Buffett, whose Berkshire Hathaway held 9.4% of Kraft, publicly opposed the deal. He told CNBC he'd vote no if he could. He thought deal momentum fueled by investment bankers was pushing it forward, a machine that, once started, couldn't be stopped regardless of whether the destination made sense. But the fatal dynamic was the one that Roger Carr would later describe with quiet fury. When the bid began, hedge funds held approximately 5% of Cadbury shares. They were background noise. As the battle progressed, as the share price climbed toward the expected offer level, hedge funds bought Cadbury shares specifically to tender them at a profit. They weren't investors. They had no interest in Cadbury's products, its workers, its heritage, or its village. They were arbitrageurs, traders who bought shares in a target company during a takeover, held them for days or weeks, and sold them to the bidder at a guaranteed profit. By the final stage, hedge funds held approximately 30% of Cadbury's stock. 30%. Nearly a third of the votes that would decide the fate of 186 years of Quaker enterprise were held by people who had owned those shares for weeks. People who had never musted Cadbury's chocolate, never walked through Bourneville, never known the smell of cocoa on the morning air. Their calculation was simple. Buy at $7.90, sell at $8.40, collect the spread, move on to the next deal. On the 19th of January 2010, Kraft raised its offer. 500 pence in cash plus 0.1874 new Kraft shares per Cadbury share, valuing each share at 840 pence, plus a special 10 pence dividend. Total value: approximately £11.5 billion. Kraft financed the deal with over $12 billion in debt, partly funded by the Royal Bank of Scotland, which was part owned by the state following its taxpayer bailout, meaning that British public money was helping to finance the hostile foreign takeover of a beloved British company. Kraft also sold its North American frozen pizza business to Nestlé for $3.7 billion to increase the cash component. The Cadbury board unanimously recommended acceptance. On the 2nd of February 2010, shareholders representing 71.73% of Cadbury shares accepted. 186 years. Gone in 5 months. Chapter 11, 7 days. Felicity Loudon, George Cadbury's great-great-granddaughter, had been the most vocal family opponent throughout the battle. She called Kraft an American plastic cheese company and warned that her ancestors would be turning in their graves knowing Cadbury had been sold to a company that makes cheese to go on hamburgers. She later put her £27 million country estate up for sale to fund a rival chocolate company. Sir Dominic Cadbury, the last family member to have worked at the company, delivered the epitaph. 180 years of history gone, and I would argue 180 years of being a beacon of good practice, all gone, and it was so easy. Todd Stitzer resigned on the 3rd of February, one day after the deal became unconditional. His farewell. "You can be sure my heart will always be a deep Cadbury purple." A year later, writing in the Times, he put it differently. "I am richer at the bank, but sadder in my heart." In the end, we created significant shareholder value. The paradox is, we lost the company. Roger Carr, who also stepped down on the 3rd of February, later framed the systemic failure with a precision that deserves to be remembered. Something has happened to the system that appears to tip the playing field to short-termism. Whilst capitalism is efficient, it may be unreasonable that a few individuals with weeks of share ownership can determine the lifetime destiny of many. Cadbury was delisted from the London Stock Exchange on the 8th of March 2010. The purple ticker vanished from the screens where it had appeared every trading day since the FTSE 100's creation in 1984. And then, 7 days after the takeover became unconditional, Kraft broke its promise. On the 9th of February 2010, Kraft announced it had reluctantly accepted that Cadbury's plans to close the Somerdale factory were so far advanced that it was unrealistic to reverse them. The company claimed Cadbury had already invested over £100 million in building new facilities in Poland, and that the majority of production lines had been, or were about to be, transferred. 7 days, 5 months of public promises, formal offer documents, statements to Parliament, commitments to a workforce of 500 people who'd been told their factory, the Fry family factory, built in the 1920s, producing fudge and curly-whirly and Turkish delight, would be saved. 7 days, and it was over. Jack Dromey of Unite said it plainly. "A proud workforce in a proud community had their hopes raised and their hopes then dashed. It was utterly cynical." Unite National Officer Jenny Formby called the promises a cynical attempt to curry favour with the British public during what was an extremely unpopular and unwelcome takeover. The House of Commons Business, Innovation and Skills Committee, chaired by Peter Lough MP, launched an investigation. Irene Rosenfeld was invited to testify. She refused. The committee called her refusal a regrettably dismissive attitude to a national parliament. In her place, Kraft sent Executive Vice President Mark Firestone, who said he was truly sorry and used the word 3 times. He claimed Kraft could not have known the extent of Cadbury's Polish investment because the information was not in the public domain during the hostile bid. The committee's verdict was unsparing. Kraft had acted both irresponsibly and unwisely in making its original statement. The takeover panel issued its first public censure in 3 years, finding that Kraft's statements about Somerdale had not met the standards required. The panel concluded that Kraft had been warned by Cadbury's own management on the 18th and 19th of January, the very day before the final offer, that the closure plans were well advanced. Kraft had not asked for further information. It had proceeded with its belief. It had told the country what the country wanted to hear. And then it had done what it had always intended to do. Somerdale closed in March 2011. Approximately 400 workers lost their jobs. The production moved to Skarbimierz, Poland, a 65,000 square metre facility with over 600 employees, described as the most modern chocolate factory in Europe. The Somerdale site was sold for £50 million for redevelopment. When the committee reconvened in May 2011 for its follow-up report, titled "With the dry understatement of a parliamentary committee that has been personally affronted," "Is Kraft working for Cadbury?" Rosenfeld again refused to appear, not even by video link. Chapter 12. The Name Nobody Wanted. On the 1st of October 2012, Kraft Foods split. The North American grocery business became Kraft Foods Group. The global snacks business, including Cadbury, became Mondelez International. The name had been coined from over 1,700 employee submissions. Monde, from the Latin mundus, meaning world, and delez, as a fanciful expression of delicious. It was immediately and universally mocked. Critics noted it sounded like a second-rate Vegas hotel. In an exquisite detail, it resembled a vulgar Russian slang term. A branding executive told the press, "You hear E's like sleaze. I'm getting nothing from it." Under Mondelez, the changes came steadily. In August 2012, the classic angular dairy milk chunks were changed to curved rounded segments, 4 grams lighter per bar, at the same price. An Oxford professor confirmed that people associate roundness with sweetness and angularity with bitterness, meaning the same recipe in a different shape literally tastes different. In January 2015, the cream egg shell was switched from Cadbury dairy milk chocolate to a cheaper standard cocoa mix. Multipacks were reduced from 6 eggs to 5. Cadbury's defence was brazen. The creamer egg has never been called the Cadbury's dairy milk cream egg. Analysts found Cadbury lost more than £6 million in creamy egg sales that Easter. Shrinkflation hit systematically. Dairy milk bars from 140 grams to 120, then 49 grams to 45. Sharing bars from 200 grams to 180. Brunch bar multipacks dropped from 5 to 4. Freddo multipacks from 5 to 4. The product that George Cadbury Jr. had formulated with 2.5 glasses of milk per half-pound bar was being whittled down, gram by gram, reformulation by reformulation, into something that still carried the name, but no longer carried the covenant. In November 2016, Cadbury Dairy Milk, which had been Fairtrade certified since 2009, in what had been a landmark moment for the fair trade movement, dropped the Fairtrade logo in favour of Mondelez's in-house Cocoa Life programme. The Fairtrade minimum price of $2,000 per tonne would no longer apply. In 2013, pensioners had been denied their traditional free chocolate treats, a small gesture that had cost the company almost nothing and meant almost everything to the retired workers who'd given their lives to the factory. In 2014, Cadbury ended production of chocolate coins, and then came the tax. A Sunday Times investigation in December 2015 found that Mondelez had paid no UK corporation tax since the 2010 takeover, despite Cadbury UK making profits of £96.5 million in 2014 and £83.6 million in 2013, on UK revenues of approximately £2 billion. The mechanism was an unsecured £8.2 billion debt listed as a bond on the Channel Islands Stock Exchange, whose interest payments could be offset against UK profits. Kraft had also created a holding company in Zurich and used Dutch subsidiaries for further avoidance. For comparison, in its last full year before restructuring, Cadbury had paid £197 million in UK tax. Under Mondelez, zero. A company that George Cadbury had built on the Quaker principle that business exists to serve the community was now structured to ensure that the community received nothing. The takeover triggered the most significant overhaul of the UK Takeover Code in years. The reforms, effective the 19th of September 2011, popularly known as the Cadbury Law, imposed a 28-day put-up or shut-up deadline on bidders. Break fees and deal protection measures were banned. Bidders were required to disclose detailed intentions regarding employees, management, business locations, and pensions. Employee representatives gained the right to have their opinions published. Hostile bids declined sharply afterward, only 8 in the period following the reforms compared to 25 in the year ending March 2010. The law changed because of Cadbury, but the law changed too late for Cadbury. Chapter 13. What the Trust preserved. The Bourneville factory still operates. Mondelez calls it their global centre of excellence for chocolate research and development. It produces approximately 300 million dairy milk bars, 300 million cream eggs, and 47 million Easter eggs annually, across 23 production lines, turning out 350 tonnes of milk chocolate per day. Every new chocolate product Mondelez develops for 150 countries starts its life at Bourneville. Over £80 million has been invested since 2014 to modernise the factory. A £15 million investment in 2021 brought 125 million more dairy milk sharing bars back from European production. But the workforce has contracted from approximately 10,000 at its peak to roughly 1,000 today. Automation and cost-cutting account for some of that reduction. The rest is explained by geography. Mondelez operates 7 manufacturing sites in Poland employing approximately 5,100 staff, far more than its entire UK manufacturing workforce. The Scarbermiège plant alone, the one that replaced Somerdale, has over 600 employees and more than 10 production lines. Cadbury World, the visitor attraction, still welcomes over 500,000 visitors a year. It is now operated by Merlin Entertainments under a 50-year deal signed in 2022. The experience is polished. The chocolate is available in the gift shop. The history is told in the exhibition halls. But the connection between the factory and the village, the living, breathing relationship between the place where the chocolate was made and the community that was built around it, has thinned to something more like heritage tourism than shared life. And yet, the Bourneville Village Trust, the independent charity George Cadbury established on the 14th of December 1900, is not merely surviving. It is thriving. It manages approximately 8,950 homes across Birmingham and Shropshire. It employs 233 staff. Its group turnover in 2024 was £31.8 million. Its governance rating from the Regulator of Social Housing is G1, the highest possible. The estate covers 1,000 acres, is home to over 25,000 people, and includes 100 acres of parks and open space. The no pubs rule technically ended in 2015 when a local newsagent received an alcohol licence. But the spirit of temperance remains embedded. There are still no pubs in Bourneville. When a referendum was held on allowing off-licence sales, 80% of residents voted to keep the village dry. The Trust maintains design guides so exacting that even owner-occupiers must obtain BVT permission for exterior changes. Extensions, windows, fencing, even wheelie bin storage. The pepper potting model, deliberately mixing social rent and owner-occupied homes so they are visually indistinguishable, remains intact. Preserving the egalitarian vision of a man who believed that where you lived shouldn't advertise how much you earned. Property values in Bourneville carry a premium over surrounding areas. The village has been a designated conservation area since 1971, with multiple Grade 2 listed buildings. The Carillon Tower still rings its 48 bells. The playing fields at Rowheath are still in use. The Friends Meeting House still stands beside the green. And the chocolate smell persists. 300 million dairy milk bars a year will do that. Residents and visitors still catch the aroma drifting from the factory, across the gardens with their fruit trees, along streets where no two houses look the same, through a village that was built on the conviction that working people deserved beauty. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation, born from the same Quaker tradition, remains a leading UK poverty research charity. The Barrow Cadbury Trust works on social justice. Woodbrook, George Cadbury's former Birmingham home, operates as a Quaker study centre. And James Cadbury, a descendant of the founder, has launched Love Cocoa, an ethical chocolate brand that attempts, in a small way, to rebuild what his ancestors' company lost. The pattern is consistent. The companies fell. The trusts survived. Fry's was absorbed in 1919. Rowntree was consumed by Nestlé in 1988. Cadbury was taken by Kraft in 2010. Each takeover followed the same script: a beloved British brand, a foreign bidder, a government unable or unwilling to intervene, promises made and broken, jobs lost, production moved overseas. But the charitable structures, the trusts, the foundations, the village itself, endure. Because George Cadbury understood something that the shareholders who sold his company in February 2010 did not. Companies are legal fictions. They exist on paper. They can be bought, sold, split, renamed, hollowed out. Communities built on charitable trust deeds, anchored in bricks and gardens and schools and bells, are harder to kill. Chapter 14. The Smell on the Breeze. The Bourneville train station is still painted in Cadbury purple. It's a small thing, a coat of paint on a suburban platform. But it's there, a quiet declaration that this place is different from the stations before and after it on the cross-city line, that something happened here which deserved its own colour. Walk from the station into the village and you'll find the green and the rest house at its centre and the meeting house where George and Elizabeth Cadbury's ashes are interred. The fruit trees are still in the gardens. The design rules are still enforced. The houses still look like they belong to a village, not an estate, no two the same, each one set back from the road with enough land to grow roses. A company built over 186 years on the conviction that business exists to serve the people who do the work, that no man ought to be condemned to live in a place where a rose cannot grow, was sold in 5 months by investors who'd held its shares for weeks to a corporation that broke its first promise within 7 days. But the village is still here, not because the company protected it. The company couldn't even protect itself. The village is here because one man, 125 years ago, understood that the most important thing he could build was the thing that didn't depend on the company at all. George Cadbury made the chocolate, but he made the trust independent. He put the village beyond the reach of any future shareholder, any future board, any future bidder arriving from across the ocean with a checkbook and a promise. The factory hums. 1,000 workers, where once there were 10,000. The chocolate still comes off the lines, 350 tons a day, wrapped in purple, stamped with a name that began in a shop on Bull Street where a Quaker grocer filled children's cups to the brim. And on the right morning, if the wind is coming from the right direction, you can stand on the village green and catch it. That smell, warm, rich, sweet, drifting across the gardens and the playing fields and the houses with their fruit trees, the way it has drifted for 140 years. It's the smell of something that was built to last. Some of it did.